Welcome to Sabbath Apologetics. I'm here to share a little bit with you on the topic of where do we get all of these crazy ideas about what's going to happen at the end of the world. And by we, I don't mean any specific group. I'm sure that you've probably heard of Joel Richardson, who has lots of ideas about how Islam plays into the final events and the final things that are going to take place at the end of the world, and provides multiple applications of the Antichrist. Or you've read Tim LaHaye's book or seen the movie about the secret rapture and then the end of the world coming, and all sorts of crazy things that take place, from people disappearing as they're flying a plane, disappearing from vehicles all over the world, and then there's this period of tribulation, the rise of an Antichrist, the end of the world, and finally Jesus comes back. And maybe you've seen all this stuff, and a lot of it could either be stressful or weirding you out a little bit. Like, what in the world? Where do we get all of these crazy ideas about the end of the world? And how come everyone seems to be in different places when it comes to interpreting Bible prophecy on this very topic? So that's what we're going to talk about today. Get excited, hang on, join us. I'm excited to talk about it, and so yeah, let's go. All right, so first, let me just say this: there are four basic different schools of interpretation of apocalyptic literature. And then within those schools, you get all sorts of variations of those applications within those schools. So for example, you have these four schools, which we're going to call Idealism, Historicism, Futurism, and Preterism. And those four schools, you have a variety of different views within those four major schools of prophetic interpretation. Now stick with me, because we're going to be here at first getting a little technical, but afterwards I'm going to tell you a storyline. I'm going to tell you the storyline of history and the arc of where these major schools came from and how you can kind of package them in your mind. All right, so you have these four basic schools of interpretation. I think before we talk about where they came from and how they developed, I think it's a lot easier just to kind of get an idea of what they believe and kind of a general sense of what they are. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Here's some crazy applications of apocalyptic texts. Four major schools of thought. All right, these are your four major schools. So what is idealism? Idealism takes this apocalyptic literature and it seeks to spiritualize it. Basically, it makes it applicable to people's lives in any generation. And it makes these events or people within the storyline, it spiritualizes them so everything is applicable to you. For example, if you take the story of Laodicea, the fact that here God is spewing out of his mouth people that are lukewarm. I wish you were either hot or cold, but instead you piddle around with Christianity. You piddle around with Christ. You're not really digging in. This is applicable to every period of history. And so it doesn't really have a historical application, whether that's a first century, middle of time, end of time application. It really is always applicable. And this is a big approach among scholars today, approaching the text saying, really these texts were meant to be spiritualized and applied to individuals' lives. And there's some cool things that you can do with that, but I don't know if that is really being faithful to the text. Historicism is another one here. Historicism is a way to look at the text as symbols of real kingdoms, real events, and real people that are in a historical timeline from the beginning of the prophecy until the end. And often what it does is it looks at these apocalyptic prophecies, and it looks at them as being symbols of realities that take place in history along a historical timeline. Now you'll notice I've blacked out some things. That's because I'm not necessarily trying to be apologetic about what I think is the most accurate today. Today, what I want to do is I just want to give you an idea of where do all of these crazy ideas about the end of the world come from. So that just gives you, that's just to tell you what the point is, where we're going. So let's go to the next one. Futurism is a belief that the Antichrist in the book of Daniel, the Olivet Discourse, and what does that mean, first of all? Well, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are these chapters where Jesus speaks prophetically to the people. And it's called the Olivet Discourse. And it shows up in 3 of those of the Gospels. And so you have the Antichrist in Daniel, the Olivet Discourse, and the entire book of Revelation after chapter 4 applying to a person. So the Antichrist is a single person, and events that will take place at the very end of Earth's history, and we have not gotten there yet. Okay. So that's a very big part of futurism, is it hasn't occurred yet. Some people have identified this as a gap theory, and the reason is because there's 70 weeks in a prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, and what they've essentially done is they've added historical applications until the last week, and then from the first century they've essentially taken that last week, they've removed it, and they've placed it at the very end of time in the future. And so there's a gap there in the application of prophecy from the first century until the end of time. And this is futurism. Preterism is a belief that nearly every event took place before the end of the first century. So it's all done. Now that's not entirely true, because there's really 2 large groups of preterists, and I'll jump into that in a minute. But before I emphasize those 2 different groups, these are essentially the 4 basic schools of interpretation. And I would say the majority of common Christians don't really believe in idealism. The majority of them think that the text is actually applicable to some point in history, whether that's in the past, in the present, or in the future. So idealism is really a belief for the scholars, I would say, and then there's, historicism, which is basically not believed by many people. It had a very large period of popularity, but not many people buy into historicism, meaning that the application of these apocalyptic prophecies took place over a very long period of time. The church age would be what this really applies to, this apocalyptic literature. And it would be really from the first century in the book of Revelation till the end of the world and after the millennium. Or you're looking at other texts like Daniel, and you're saying, okay, so it started maybe 500 years before Jesus and then goes into the future. Specifically 490. But anyway, so you have historicism, which really isn't believed. And then you have these 2 popular belief systems. Futurism is maybe the most popular amongst Protestants, evangelicals, and you may find some Catholics and Orthodox that would buy into it. But usually Catholics are going to buy into preterism. That's largely the belief system that they have. And then preterism has actually started making a big entrance into society recently, in the last 100 years. It's grown in the world. Futurism really blew up around the 1900s. And I'm going to talk about the history, but right now, those are really the popular belief systems. One is basically saying, hey, it's all been done. It was finished by the end of the first century. By 100 AD, everything was done. Preterism, okay? And then futurism, like we haven't even gotten to the majority of stuff. So there were some things that happened in the first century, and then the rest of it doesn't take place until the very last moment of time. Okay, so there's these 2 major systems that are really popular today, currently. So I want to say that these 4 schools are not necessarily the best way to identify what people believe, because it gets more intricate than that. The texts are, flavorful, and everybody has a little different taste. And so within these schools, you really have to break it down a little bit further. And so some have suggested that it's easier to break it down based on the millennium, or based on books, such as, okay, there's certain views that come with Daniel, there's certain views that come with Jesus' words, there's certain views that come with Revelation, 2 Thessalonians, Isaiah chapter 2, and other texts in the Bible, Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel. There's certain applications of these things. You got to take it book by book. If we were to do that, what you'd come to is kind of various views on Daniel that look something like this. Daniel's a history book. It's not a prophecy book. Most likely, it was written by priests somewhere around in the 2nd century BC, and they were writing on the history of Israel and acting like they were Daniel. It really wasn't written by Daniel. Now, I told you that I wasn't really going to give you my thoughts, a lot of thoughts on this, but this to me is a heretical belief. If you believe in the inspiration of Scripture, I think it's really hard to buy into this belief system. Now, there's a version of Preterism, and actually a number of Catholics, devout Catholics, and a number of scholars and different preterists, which would call themselves actually Orthodox preterists or classic preterists, or they would look at this sort of full preterism is what you might call it, full preterist idea, and they would actually push it out and say, we don't believe in that. And some of them, while they believed all the things were finished in the 1st century, there are some of them that actually believe that things like the Antichrist, the rise of the Antichrist, and the coming of Jesus, those literal events in these books actually will happen at the end of time. But most believe that it took place in the 1st century. There's some division amongst partial preterists on that. So first you have this kind of history book, not prophecy book, view of Daniel. And then you have this kind of 1st century completion, which is like partial preterism version 1. And then you have this 1st century plus the end of time, which is partial preterism version 2. Okay, and then you finally have this futurism view on the book of Daniel, which is 1, 2, skip a few, 99, 100. I just said that because it's like a gap. There's a gap in there. They'll take all of these prophecies in a historical continuum until a point, and then they stop, and then they skip a major period of history, and then sometime in the future, these prophecies will pick up again. And sometimes this has been known as dispensationalism, and the reason it's called that is because there's been this view that was kind of put forth by a guy named Darby that Earth kind of exists, and there's periods of history that are dispensations of history. And the Jewish dispensation ended, and there was a week left on the Jewish dispensation. And that week was picked up and put down at some point later in history. And so that dispensation will continue at some point. And most dispensationalists believe in some sort of secret rapture or rapture of the church prior to a tribulation, a period in which there's going to be terrible things that happen. And so when this rapture takes place, the Jewish dispensation will begin. And often this week is a week of years. It's 7 years of time. Some have even cut that in half to say it's actually 3.5 years of time, so that the church either disappears at the beginning of those 7 years, or the church is taken away in the middle of those 7 years, or the church is taken away at the end of those 7 years. So you have what's called pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib versions of that. And so I meant to black out those names right there, because I got started entering the church fathers into who kind of believed some of these things early on. Historicism, I didn't put in here. The view of the book of Daniel, according to historicists, is a continuous timeline. It's pretty straightforward for most of historicist application in most of the books. Again, stick with me. I'm going to get into stories here in a minute. We're going to start talking about, well, how did all of these things come about? This is a little bit technical, but for those who want that technical stuff, I'm trying to give it to you. So what are some of the different views on the book of Revelation? Well, you have first century only. All this stuff was finished in the first century. Then you have first century and end of time, which is that version 1 of partial preterism. And then you have first century end of time version 2, which is actually futurism. So actually preterism and partial preterism kind of agree in one version of partial preterism that the things in the book of Revelation all took place in the first century. Now there's another version of preterism, version 2 of partial preterism, that says that, it took place in the first century, and then some of these things actually apply to the end of the world. And then there's the first century end of time version 2, which is the futurism idea. And they break down differently. They apply differently, and a lot of it has to do with the millennium. A lot of it has to do with how you apply the millennium. And so we're going to talk about the millennium in a minute. Then you have the idealistic approach, which is that these actually, they're all just spiritually applied. And the historicism approach, which is this is a continuous historical timeline. Now let me get down into the different timelines of the millennium, on the millennium, and how they would relate to Revelation and history. So you essentially have these 4 views. Obviously, again, these could be subdivided, but let's give 4 major views. You have this pre-tribulation, premillennialism. What am I saying here? So actually, I'll just pull up pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, premillennialism. I'm going to pull up a chart here, and you can kind of see. You get the idea. There's the cross of Christ on the left. Okay? Then there's a period of time known as the church age. Okay? And then you have what you have is the second coming of Jesus. Okay? And then you have the last judgment. Now, where does the millennium fit in there? And where does tribulation fit in there? So the first one here is this post-tribulation premillennialism. So it's after the tribulation, it's before the millennium that Christ comes to get his church. So you have the church age, you have tribulation, then Christ comes, then you have a millennium, and then you have the last judgment. Okay, then the second belief system that you have here is pre-tribulation, meaning that Christ comes for his church before the tribulation takes place. So there's Christ, the church age. Christ comes to get his church before they have to go through tribulation. Okay, and then he comes back again, which really should be called the third coming, but it's the second coming with the church. And then there's the millennium, and then there's the last judgment. And this is often futurism. And the first one is often, that one could be futurism, or it could be preterism, or it could be historicism. Historicists definitely saw, are definitely, fit in that first one. And then there's postmillennialism, which kind of says that the Great Tribulation or the Tribulation and the church age are in a period of time, 1,000 literal years, okay, in which they're going to kind of take over on earth, and they're going to rule, and there's going to be this Christian age for 1,000 years. And after the 1,000 years, this literal 1,000 years that Christians rule the earth, then you're going to have the second coming and the last judgment. And that's the application of the millennium there. Well, then there's this kind of amillennialism, which is like, okay, the millennium is just symbolic of the church age. They're one and the same. So that this like 2,000 year period that we've been living in, that is the millennium. We're living the millennium right now. Like we're living Revelation chapter 20. We're living it out. A lot of times this is preterism that really buys into this belief on the amillennium. That's definitely where the biggest amount of preterists fall in their package. So then following the church age, you have the second coming and the last judgment. All right, so I spit a whole bunch of information at you, right? Tons of information. Now, let me kind of synthesize that a little bit, and then we'll talk about what are the history of these. Where did all these ideas come from? So first of all, let me just say, so there's obviously, right out of the gate, a lot of different views on how the application of Scripture comes into play. And then there's subdivisions of those four big major schools of thought. And then there's weird overlaps, and so that people believe some things and they take some other things from other people and they put it all together. So a lot of folks have come to the conclusion, oh man, we really should not be making any of this stuff an issue. Like, why are we making this an issue? Like, this stuff should be like, I mean, stuff that maybe we talk about, but definitely it doesn't divide the church because we have no clue. And this actually is kind of where idealism came from. Well, there's this idea of like, oh man, it's all just so overwhelming. So many ideas out there floating around. But I don't want you to get overwhelmed. Read the Bible. Look at it. Pray that the Holy Spirit would give you wisdom as you approach the text and kind of go at it from a view that says anything could be right. I need to learn what the truth of the Scripture is. So having said that, let's talk a little bit about where did these ideas come from. And to get started with that, I'm going to get started with Futurism. So what is Futurism and where did it come from? So first of all, you have church history, right? You have history starting out with like Christ leaving and the disciples are left there and Christianity is beginning and they're writing all of these things and weird things are happening too. Like, for example, Caligula wants to put a statue of himself, erect a statue of himself inside of the Jewish temple and turn it into a Roman temple. And there's a lot of fighting going on with that. And so while a lot of Gentiles are coming into the Christian faith, and the Christian faith at this time was a bunch of Jews who had accepted Jesus and Jews who had essentially who led the church. And Gentiles were coming more and more into the church through the works of Peter, going out and sharing the gospel, and Barnabas and some others. And so now you have Gentiles coming in and everybody's sort of kind of wondering, well, how much of the Jewish teachings do we hold on to? How much do we get rid of? Like, where does the law stand in all of this? And by law, let me qualify that. I mean the whole Old Testament. Specifically, I mean even the Torah. The whole law, meaning like the sacrifices and the societal laws. And then outside of that, the doctrine of the elders, like the ideas of like washing things, purifying, ritual purities and things like that. This was major stuff. This was major stuff with the influx of all of these Gentiles into the church. And the Jewish followers of Christ were asking these questions like, what's clean and unclean? And how much of this stuff do we hang on to or don't we hang on to? And this was major conversations happening about this stuff. Well, you find around 70 AD, as the wars between the Jews and the Roman Empire ramping up, you find this kind of Jewish separation that took place with Christianity. Yet there's this identifying characteristic that they can't quite let go of because they are Jews. But when along comes Titus, and they surround the city and they do all these things. And then he backs away for a little bit. Eusebius tells us that the Christians flee the city. They run and they escape to Pella, and the Christians don't end up getting persecuted inside of the city of Jerusalem when the Romans attack the Jewish city. Now, this causes great division and separation because, imagine you're a Jew. There's these Christians who claim to be Jews, a sect of Judaism, and yet when the Jews are defending their city, the Jewish Christians leave because Jesus made some predictions about how this was all going to go down. And so they escape, right? And so there's kind of this application of this event in AD 70 is the end of the world. And in AD 70, you really can't tell a difference between a futurist and a preterist at all. Now you might say, well, what about historicists or idealists? Yeah, I don't think the idealists were a big thing then. They came about quite a bit later when you have kind of a spiritualization of the word. And even then, that work that was done there isn't the true idealist. The idealist really comes around as a reaction to the Reformation and counter-reformation. But anyway, so you have these two schools, Futurism and Preterism, that you can't tell apart in AD 70. This is the moment, this is the application, this is what's happening. Okay, so then now let's take a step further. Let's move from that. What happens after AD 70? Well, first of all, John gets his apocalypse vision in 95, 96. Some people believe it happened, the preterists believe that it happened before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. There's not very many people, scholars, who really buy into that. Most people are going to tell you that John received these visions in 95, 96 AD. So John starts receiving these visions and he starts seeing, oh, wow, this apocalypse takes place. And it's this stuff is still applicable. There is still apocalyptic stuff to take place. And so not long after that, maybe 2 disciples later, you have people like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and people in the 100s in the 2nd century who start writing down futurist ideas. They start talking about the week of Daniel chapter 9, that historical continuum stops, and then they're taking that and they're planting it at the end of the world. But I want you to see something that's really important, because futurists often say, hey, we have the oldest view, biblical view of eschatology. And in some ways they're being fair, but in other ways they're not really being fair, because during this time, those first couple hundred years, it was Christians versus Jews, Christians versus the Romans. It was kind of like Christians were trying to understand how in the world all of their preconceived ideas, their original Jewish ideas, fit with this new type of Christianity. And so they were reading the texts, the Old Testament texts like Daniel, and the texts of the disciples, the manuscripts that were the letters and stuff that were floating around. They were reading these texts of Paul and stuff in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. They're reading this stuff and they're trying to make sense of it. They're trying to make application. So they're leaning towards, oh, look what happened in AD 70. Well, surely God is going to avenge his people because there's that Jewish blood in them. Surely God's going to avenge his people in literal Jerusalem at the end of the world. And he's going to have literal Jerusalem rebuilt, and there's going to come a antichrist, and he's going to trick the Jews into believing that they should follow him. And they're going to restart the services of the Lamb and the sanctuary services and all this stuff, and rebuild the temple and all this stuff, and then he'll come. This is kind of very futuristic, the futurism ideas. This is the narrative, is that at the end of the world, what's going to happen is that the Jews are going to rebuild the temple. And you're going to restart the sacrifices, and the Antichrist is going to come and he's going to trick the Jews into believing that he's the Antichrist. But eventually the Jews, many of them, will be saved during this time, and the Antichrist will be revealed, and then the last things will happen. And so you can imagine living at that time, like during the Bar Kokhba revolt and other events that were happening, how easily you could make these applications, and how you were trying to understand the interpretation of Bible texts like Daniel in light of the reality of events that were happening right then. And maybe this is part of the problem throughout all of history, is that instead of looking back, we've always been looking at what's happening right now and trying to make applications of what's happening right now to the text. May or may not be a good thing. But so you have this kind of futurist history. It's not long after that preterist ideas start being formulated and showing up and stuff. And some preterists, partial preterists, or whoever, will look back and they'll claim some of those same writings that futurists will claim. They'll claim that they're theirs as well. But preterist views came along. Eusebius, I mentioned him earlier when he was talking about, he was a historian that would look back, a Christian historian that looked back on events, and he read a lot of Flavius Josephus. Who was that? That was a Jewish historian that lived through AD 70 and the events leading up to it, and wrote and participated with the Romans. But he wrote on the things that happened to the Jews during the wars there, the first Jewish wars and stuff, and other events. So Eusebius looks at that and he starts making applications about how Jesus's words apply to that first century. They don't apply to some event that is coming. They apply to the first century, which is why the Christians were able to escape. Now, okay, so what you have then for hundreds of years is you have church fathers who may have mentioned some of this stuff, but there's a variety of beliefs. Those first century authors like Hippolytus, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, some reference Papias. Like even these first century authors, they're not consistent. They're inconsistent in their application. So there's obvious disagreement. There's obvious misunderstanding. Nobody has quite figured it out. And so here I am still sticking on futurism, but like now you have a major gap, all right? And one of the problems with this futurist approach, which I wanted to point out, saying that, hey, we're the oldest, is that a fundamental tenet of dispensationalism is the belief that Israel and the church are distinct peoples of God. However, the New Testament writers did not do what the New Testament writers did not do. The post-apostolic fathers, that's who I'm talking about, the church fathers, following that first century, where we get the canon of the Bible is these were eyewitnesses of Jesus and lived and talked and walked with him, and the disciples of Jesus, and divine revelation for Paul, and some of this stuff. Once you get outside of that first century, you have these post-apostolic fathers, okay? So now this statement, which I think is a really good paper that was written here, identifying that those Bible writers, where we get the canon, the New Testament Bible, which we consider very authoritative, these guys that came afterwards did something that those first writers did not do. Those first writers kind of left a separation between this Israel people group and the Israel church people of God. The post-apostolic fathers quickly started trying to make sense of their Jewish heritage and Christian heritage and Gentile heritage and the events that were taking place in the world. And all of that kind of led to specific applications in the first century, which is where you kind of have this rise of a variety of different beliefs of either preterism or futurism with those first century events. Okay. Now, you take this big gap, okay? I'm not going to talk about preterism because I did just talk about it. You take this big gap to this guy named Arnulf, the Bishop of Orleans. There's not a lot on this guy. You know, you can get out there and read some things. You take this big gap of history, and this guy comes along, and he starts making applications of how, you know who the real Antichrist is. You want to know? It's the papacy. All right? And he starts making destructive remarks about the institution of the papacy. So this is kind of the first guy, maybe he is or maybe he isn't, but he's the first guy who brings in historicism. Now, what is historicism? Really, historicism is a look back. They've come to a point in history at about 1000 AD where they're looking back at the events that have transpired over the last 1,000 years. And they start going, kind of crazy that this persecutor, this pagan persecutor in the first century, the church, the Christian church, joined forces with him. They actually hooked up and they started, getting together so that the church actually became the persecutor and the authoritative character in history who was persecuting people that didn't agree with her, and had the power of Rome behind her. And so she becomes known as this Roman Catholic, which Catholic means universal, the Roman Christian Church. And so this is the first guy of what you might call the reformers who spoke against the Roman Catholic Church, specifically the Pope or the papacy. So along comes Historicism. All right, this is the rise of Historicism and pointing to the papacy. And for the next couple hundred years, this is what takes place. You got John Wycliffe, who starts preaching against the papacy, and John Huss, who's preaching against the papacy, and then you get up to the 1500s, and now all of a sudden you have this launch pad into like the real birth of historicism, in which Martin Luther starts preaching against the papacy, and he starts doing all sorts of like intense things. Like he actually got this guy, Lucas Cranach, to make these woodcuts, and I've blown up a couple of them. But imagine memes on social media. That's what woodcuts were for the day. They'd take a piece of wood and they'd carve out an image, or they'd take a piece of paper and they'd print an image on one side and they'd put it up on the walls and stuff. But here's an example of the images. He would put double images, and on one side you would have Jesus, and here Jesus is kicking out the money changers and the people that are trying to make money off of the people of God. On the other side, you have the Pope, and he's getting all the money from the people that don't have any of the money for himself. That's like one of them, right? And then you have this other one here where Jesus is down washing. He's wearing normal clothes. He's washing the feet of the disciples. And then you have this other one here where there's the Pope. He's sitting up on a throne, and everybody's kissing his feet, and he's dressed in all of these like really royal robes. And here's another one here. You have this picture of Jesus carrying a cross, being beaten and tortured. And then you have a picture of the Pope sitting inside of a carrier that's ornate, and people are carrying him and stuff. And then you have this one. Oh, that's the last one I was going to show you. Okay, so you have these pictures, you have this idea. All of the reformers, every one of them, believed that the papacy, I shouldn't say every one of them, obviously there were some that didn't believe this, but the majority of them, definitely the big names, they all believed that the papacy, the Pope, was the Antichrist. And they made application, they preached sermons on it. Daniel and Matthew, Mark and Luke and Revelation and all of these, the Second Thessalonians chapter 2, this was the Antichrist. Now, here's one of the big problems, though, that also took place during this historicism's big day between the 1500s and the 1800s, is they believed that Jesus was coming, right? So for them, it was almost as if, not that they believed that a week was cut off of Daniel chapter 9 and moved later, which is a fundamental piece of dispensationalism and futurism, right? They didn't believe that, many of them, the majority of them. But they did believe that they were living at the end. So they were kind of in the same boat as futurists, in a sense of like, okay, well, now's the time when all of these things in Revelation are taking place. However, they were willing to look back on the past 1,500 years and see the transition into the church, the universal church of Christ, selling itself to the devil and becoming, part of the dragon. It became the sea beast in Revelation, and it gave itself to the dragon. And so all of these reformers were preaching this stuff. But again, they thought that Jesus was coming in their time. And this got to a fever pitch around the late 1700s, early 1800s. I'll go ahead. So then around this time period, everybody started using, this was something all the reformers were using, was the day-year principle. They all were using this idea. They were taking these time periods and they were saying, well, a day equals a year. And there's a couple Bible texts you can look to for that. Numbers 14 is one of them. I think Ezekiel chapter 4 is another one, where you're taking this idea that a day equals a year. And so all these reformers are making these prophetic applications to time periods. In fact, one of them, I think it was, I don't want to be wrong, but I think it was, who was it? I want to say John Wesley, but that's not right. It's somebody. It is somebody. Anyway, it was a big name reformer who made an application that the end of the world would be, the time of tribulation would start in 2015, which is really interesting. So if there's 7 years, basically Jesus is going to come back in 2022, and you can look forward to that. Maybe it was Thomas Kramer. Man, I'm not sure. Okay. Anyway, so there's at least one of these predictive prophecies that took place just a couple years ago. So they have these applications of prophecy according to year-day principle. Along comes all these guys in the 1800s making these timeline prophecies as well. This is where you have the rise of idealism, where they're kind of like, man, Preterism, Futurism, Historicism, everybody make application to everything. I just can't get on board. I think that this stuff can have personal application to you in your life right now. And it can, and that's really a beautiful thing. And so that's kind of where idealism really came from. And then it became more scholarly in the 20th century. But anyway, so not really going to get into idealism. It's not, a big system, if you will, although some people really love it. But historicism burned out. It burned out a lot of folks because Jesus didn't come. And I'm talking about multiple movements, multiple predictions, multiple things by these reformers, and Jesus didn't come. So what ended up happening? People kind of gave up on historicism. And there's this kind of like law in history. When Jesus doesn't come and you sell everything you own, you start to get a little burned. You're like, man, I sold everything I had. So there's this kind of like, oh man, they just keep preaching that Jesus is coming and he didn't come. So they burned out on historicism. And there's another storyline that's playing out at this exact same time. In the 1500s, because everybody, like historicism was blowing up, everybody was pointing at the papacy, the Pope, the Catholic Church, as the Antichrist. The papacy was reeling. The Pope was upset, didn't know what to do. Out of this came the Jesuit order. And the idea was, come up with ideas that are counter to the narrative that's being preached about the papacy. So during this time, a few Jesuit scholars, Jesuit, I think, are they priests? They basically did what no one had done before them. Maybe you could point to like one or two folks who had kind of done this, before them, but nobody really had gone through and systematized and dealt with the books rather than just a quote here or a quote there, but really dealt with the books of like Daniel and Revelation and all the sayings of Jesus and Thessalonians, and put it together into a system of thought. And so in the counter-reformation, with the order of the Jesuits, came across these different belief systems. One was Preterism. Everything was finished in the first century. It's all done and over with. Another is, kind of partial Preterism, where like maybe some of these events can also fit at the end of time. The second thing that the Jesuit order came up with was Futurism. They packaged it together in a nice way, and then they started promoting these ideas. Well, eventually, Futurism was kind of like, by the Catholic churches, they were like, no, we're not going to accept that one, because there was still this idea within Futurism that Rome would be the person at the end of time who would rise again. Now, to them, it was going to be some sort of thing like pagan Rome, with a religious character, individual, right, that would come along and they would be pagan Rome, and they would carry the kingdom, whatever kingdom that was, and that it would be, and this is where you get things like this Joel Richardson stuff, where like, Istanbul and the Golden Horn, is going to be the capital of the Antichrist at the end, and some of these other guys that talk about Rome being the capital at the end. Rome, the Roman Catholic Church wanted to distance themselves from that idea, even though that wasn't the Jesuits pushing that idea. The Jesuits were pushing an idea that all this stuff applies to way down in the future, not the Roman Catholic Church. Some entity at the end that Rome is symbolic for. And so this is where kind of, Futurism made its mark, but then the Catholic Church distanced itself. And it wasn't very popular at all. Preterism wasn't very popular at all. I mean, it was pushed by the Catholics. And so, if you were Catholic, you usually didn't even study this stuff, at least not until more recent, the last 100 or 200 years. Preterists the Catholics didn't really study this stuff unless you were a scholar in the Jesuit order. But then, so now you get it, the downfall in the 1800s of historicism. And during this same time, there's a couple of guys in England who kind of popularize Futurism. They've studied some of maybe the works of some of the Jesuits on this stuff, and they start getting the idea, maybe Ribera, I think his name's Francisco Ribera, had some good ideas here. And so he starts to get popularized in England. And at the end of the 1800s, Darby comes along. And Darby was kind of known as the father of Futurism, the father of dispensationalism, with these applications of like Romans and the recovery of the Jews and stuff. He comes along and he makes Futurism popular amongst Protestants, so that the belief system that was a Catholic belief system gets adopted into Protestants in England. Well, after that, it's not long until Scofield comes along and he writes a reference Bible. And in the reference Bible, he takes the positions of Darby and dispensationalism. That Bible was so popular in the early 1900s, they printed millions of them. And it went all over. That was a hugely popular Bible. And so then people got their ideas of the interpretations of Daniel, the Gospels, and Revelation from the Scofield Bible. And it grew big amongst evangelical populations especially, but amongst the Protestant church. And so then you have this interpretation that became popular, and it rose really big. And Preterism is kind of making a comeback. And now we're in the 1900s. Okay, so this isn't long ago. We're within the last 100 years. So after the Scofield Bible, it starts influencing pastors and people all over the U.S. and all over the world. And now you have things like Tim LaHaye coming around and doing the Left Behind series, and pastors preaching about, the secret rapture, and then this like applications of what sort of ideas will take place, what the Antichrist will look like, and you start getting applications to like Adolf Hitler, and to the Jews that are being persecuted by Adolf Hitler, and start getting these current time applications, which is what these guys are doing now, like Tim LaHaye and these other people. They're making these current applications. They're looking around at things that are taking place in the world, and they're making current applications. And this is kind of where all of these crazy ideas come from today. They're taking prophecies and they're taking schools of thoughts and they're making current applications about what the applications of these systems of thought would be in the world that we live in. And so even though it's called futurism, a lot of the applications that futurists make are looking at the things that are happening today and saying, oh, how does this fit? How does this make sense for today? Historicists do the same thing. Partial preterists who believe in the second coming of Jesus and those kind of last Antichrist and apocalyptic events at the end of the world, they're doing the same thing. So all of these people who believe any sort of apocalyptic literature can apply today are making applications to the world that we live in. I want to kind of end this whole presentation with that's John Nelson Darby. I meant to put him up there when I was kind of talking about him. But I want to kind of end this with a couple quotes for you on what can we do? What should we do? And again, I'm not going to who's right, who's wrong today. If you want that, I can come in and give you some ideas on apocalyptic literature. But I want to give you some about what is prophecy really all about. I encourage you to read 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Paul is pretty specific when he says that prophecy is for the edification of the church. That's what it's for. It's for the edification of the church. Brethren, don't be as children in understanding, like babies, but in understanding be mature. Tongues are for a sign, not to those who believe, but to unbelievers. But prophesying is not for unbelievers, but for those who believe. But prophesying is not for unbelievers, but for those who believe. Jesus said, hey, I'm telling you these things so that when they come to pass, then you will know that what I said is true and you'll believe it. So being predictive, it's a natural thing, but it's like let's keep it inside the church thing. It's predictive inside of the church. It's really prophecy is for edification of the body of believers, so that you can say, look at this. This event has taken place, and this is clearly what Jesus was talking about. Revelation, these are the things that must shortly take place hereafter. This book of prophecy are things that will take place in time, in real space and time. Again, he says, don't seal the words of this prophecy and of this book, for the time is at hand. These events will take place in real time and space. So here's what I want you to know, is that prophecy can be for and is for the purpose of looking at history, looking at events, and seeing that Christ has been accurate. And I like to think that there's ways that you can do that with the scripture, that you can actually take the scripture, the words of Christ, the words of Daniel, the words of Revelation, and not all of it is in the future. That you can actually look at history and you can start going, and obviously I'm a historicist, so I'm going to come out and say that you can actually look at history and start making applications to say, I see how Christ has been faithful over time, and how these things have come to be true. Now, I think I've done a pretty good job here, maybe not, of giving you an idea of where these crazy ideas have come from, how they've gotten to be where we've gotten to be. Most of it is individuals within a system trying to apply current events to prophecy. And I think the way I understand prophecy is that that's not what it's for. It's not so much for current events. It's for looking back at history and seeing that God has been faithful in what he predicted ahead of time that has taken place in history and come true. It's not for being predictive about what will take place in the future. Although prophecy does that, but that predictiveness is so that we in the future can look back at history and see what God's done for us. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Subscribe if you like hearing about these things. There's a lot more I could say. I could go into more depth. I could talk about prophetic events that have taken place in history and how there's variation in how people apply those things. But what I think is the most important. If you're interested in that, let me know below. I love doing this stuff. So thanks so much. God bless.